Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Be a Friend Friday. This is actually our first Be a Friend Friday of the new year, which is very, very exciting. And as our new episode begins, Crystal Woodward here is our very first guest of 2022. So it's very, very exciting. She'll be talking with us today about all things award-winning SafeAtSchool program. So to start things off, Crystal, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here to begin with?
Sure, Donna. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Yes, I'm Crystal Woodward. I direct the association's SafeAtSchool program, and SafeAtSchool falls under the umbrella of advocacy. It's our anti-discrimination program to make sure that children with diabetes are treated fairly at school and have access to appropriate care. What brought me here initially was in 1991, my daughter Devin, who was then 17 months old, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And when she was in the third grade and we were living in a Washington, D.C. suburb, we experienced some challenges with getting the care that she needed at school. And at that time, I wasn't working as an employee for ADA, I was a volunteer. So I reached out to ADA and worked with ADA and other parent volunteers in Virginia to pass the first SafeAtSchool law in the country. And then shortly after that, I came on board with the association, with the SafeAtSchool program. So I've been on board as an employee with ADA for about 22 years now. But my goal is really, I want for other students with diabetes what my daughter and other children in Virginia were able to benefit from and continue to benefit from. So we've come a long way since 1999. But we still have a long way to go. So that's how I got here.
That's amazing. It's a passion project for you. So
it absolutely is my passion. And we have come a long way. I mean, back in 1999, I think one of the biggest challenges was convincing schools to allow students with diabetes to check their blood sugar in the classroom.
mm-hmm.
We rarely hear about that as being an issue these days. Mm-hmm. So, it's really evolved. Things have come along. We've got all kinds of new and wonderful diabetes technology and treatment therapies. Things have just become so much more precise. I want to say easier. It's not necessarily easier. Mm-hmm. But we really have come a long way, both in the management of diabetes for children and other patients with diabetes, but also what we are able to accomplish in the school setting in terms of getting children with diabetes the care they need.
So, question about your daughter, right? How does your daughter feel seeing you do all this work? Like, what does she think about all of it?
I think my daughter, let me just say, she was diagnosed when she was 17 months old, and she's about to turn 32. So, and she is an ICU nurse in a Northern Virginia hospital. And I think, one of the reasons she was attracted to nursing was because of the school nurses that she had during her elementary and high school years that were extremely supportive of her. So I think, she sees this as turning lemons into lemonade to some extent. Diabetes, it was hard then. It's still difficult. I speak to all of you parents of children with diabetes. I know it's still difficult. It does get better. You do fall into a routine, but always look for ways that you can turn diabetes into a positive if there is such a thing, and there is such a thing. So I think that's how she views it, as she took something that really literally turned our world upside down and we use that to try to make a difference for other children. And I think she's very proud. I think she's proud of the ADA and all its efforts, and very appreciative. And she's the wind beneath my wings, and we'll just continue to work hard, until there's a cure. We need to make sure that our children are safe at school by getting the help they need to keep their blood glucose levels in target range, and to make sure they're not denied opportunities, to make sure they can go on field trips, to make sure that, in the event there's no school nurse at school, that there are other trained school staff members who can provide care at all times, because children with diabetes can do anything. And we want to make sure that all the measures are in place to enable full support so these kids can grow and thrive and achieve and be successful and be healthy, right? So that's the most important part of this, is just maintaining their good health.
Absolutely. So I guess that's a great segue into the next question, which is, what is Safe at School? What is the program and how does it work?
Sure. So Safe at School is a program couched under our advocacy division that was established over 2 decades ago. And what it is it's a program that uses the legal protections of federal and state law to secure accommodations and services and access to services for students with diabetes in the school setting, at daycare, at camp, at recreational programs. So we do this. Safe at School accomplishes this through education. If you go on our website, diabetes.org/SafeAtSchool, there's a wealth of resources to help educate the educators, to help educate parents, to help educate providers about legal protections for children with diabetes. There's a lot of information about what parents need to do to make sure their children do get access to care. So it's education, right? It's negotiation. It's encouraging parents to work with their schools to write what's called a Section 504 plan, which is basically a written document that sets out all of the services and accommodations that will be provided to the student with diabetes. Safe at School is litigation. When education and negotiation don't work, sometimes we have to litigate. It's rare, but and we don't recommend it. But every once in a while, we do need to litigate in order to change policy. And then legislation. I mentioned that Virginia was one of the first states to pursue and pass Safe at School legislation in 1999. And I'm proud to say that we've had, since that time, 34 states who have aligned with Safe at School principles. So that's a great thing. So there's a wealth of resources on the website. There are virtual programs that we have planned for the year. This is one of them. We have a talk coming up in March with our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Bob Gabay, and Dr. Henry Rodriguez, who is the co-chair of our Safe at School Working Group. We have an expert panel that will be coming up in June as we launch our back to school effort, and then our Safe at School workshop, which provides some basic advice to parents on how to best prepare to send their children back at school. So we've got education, we've got resources, we've got webinars, we have training materials. We have materials that assist a school nurse or certified diabetes educators to train school staff about diabetes, about legal protections for children with diabetes. Sometimes there's still a big gap in knowledge, and just a little bit of education will go a long way. there's a lot of fear about diabetes. What is it?
Yeah.
And I think too that a lot of people still don't realize that even little kids get diabetes,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not just an old person's chronic illness, even young children. So just educating about diabetes. And kids with diabetes, most kids with diabetes look like every other kid with diabetes. It's a hidden disability.
Mm-hmm.
So just educating about the disease, about what it takes to stay healthy, what it takes to level the playing field. Children with diabetes don't need more. They need the accommodations just to level the playing field. Whether it be uh, getting permission to take an academic exam at another time because blood sugars are out of range, or
Mm-hmm.
whether it's being able to have access to diabetes supplies at all times, whether it's making sure that there's a trained school staff member on a field trip so that a parent doesn't have to come along.
Mm-hmm.
These are all actions that SafeAtSchool supports so
Mm-hmm.
that these children can have full and safe access at all times in the school setting.
Definitely. And what's amazing about the Safe at School program is that, when COVID hit, um, there was an immediate turnover in resources and, just education and it just the Safe at School program keeps up with the times, which is amazing. And it was extremely helpful. I know we're still kind of weaning or finding our way through the end of the pandemic. We want to say fingers crossed that it's the end of the pandemic, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what some really helpful resources look like when it comes to COVID-19.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when COVID-19, shortly after it first hit, I'm going to say April 2020, our team sprung into action and we created kind of a portfolio of recommendations for parents of children with diabetes and
Mm-hmm.
what needs to happen in the school setting. Of course, at that time, schools closed down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that the rights of students with diabetes go away just
Mm-hmm.
because the schools are no longer holding classes in brick and mortar buildings? No.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that a child can't have a 504 plan, or that a pediatric diabetes provider doesn't need to write medical orders? No. So we sprung into action, just giving some recommendations and tips for how uh, these kids still, they needed to be accommodated. They needed to still have access. Even in virtual classrooms, there were certain adjustments that needed to be made. For example, we wanted to make sure if a student needed to be off camera to take care of his or her diabetes during a virtual class session, we wanted to make sure that that was written into the 504 plan. But let me even step back. At the beginning of the school year, we recommend that every student have what's called a diabetes medical management plan. And of course, shortly after the onset of the pandemic, many of the providers went to telehealth. So how do you get that plan? Because that plan, once it's written, needs to be transmitted to the school or the school nurse. And how does that happen if you're not meeting in person? So a lot of the providers started using telehealth.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to make sure that those providers' orders were still getting done. So there were recommendations for writing the various written plans. There were recommendations that align with CDC and still align with CDC on the precautionary measures that schools should take to keep kids with diabetes safe.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those are changing all the time.
Yeah.
There are key articles on that website. There's studies. And we're always going back. I probably go and update that website about every other week, just to keep it current, But that is an example of how our team sprung into action, and we responded to a current, really dire situation. Because regardless of whether it was virtual or in-person learning, students with diabetes still had certain rights.
Definitely. And, during the COVID-19, the pandemic, especially towards the middle of the pandemic, there was a lot of light was shed on a lot of discrimination, right, all around the world. And part of the discrimination, there have been several examples that have come to light about, discrimination against children with diabetes in the school setting. So could you talk a little bit about what to do if your child living with diabetes is discriminated against for having diabetes?
Well, first, let me talk a little bit about discrimination, because I don't think most folks think about the denial of access to diabetes care as discrimination. So why is that discrimination? So it's discrimination because we have these federal laws in place. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act that prohibit schools from discriminating against people or students with disabilities, and diabetes is a disability. So if a child is refused or denied access to care because there's no school nurse or no one's trained to provide care, then that's discrimination. So that is discrimination. So let me just talk about, just for a minute, what are some of the typical forms discrimination takes at school. And I mentioned a few minutes ago how back in the late 1990s, how a lot of students were told they couldn't check their blood sugar in the classroom. So that's changed a lot. So what we hear about now, especially during COVID, school nurses are amazing. School nurses have a lot on their plates, but unfortunately, but understandably right now, the focus for school nurses has shifted to COVID in the school setting. And so their priorities, we've got a lot of competing priorities, but because they have this new responsibility that COVID has brought about, there's not as much time to care for children with diabetes and students with other chronic illness. So one of the things I've been hearing lately is there's no school nurse to take care of my child. And we're talking about younger children, newly diagnosed children. So what do? I'm as a parent, and this is coming from parents. Parents are being told they have to come to school to provide care for their child. So that's discrimination. That's discrimination. So the solution is to train others, to train school staff to provide that care, to be a backup for the school nurse, not to replace the school nurse, but to enhance the ability of the school nurse to provide care. So that's a very common form of discrimination that we've heard a lot about. Also, with the new technologies, I know sometimes there's a reluctance or hesitation, fear for school nurses and others to engage in the new technology. And with a little education, we're normally able to overcome that barrier. But we do hear from a lot of parents whose schools are pushing back because I think it's a lack of understanding, but they're pushing back because they don't want to respond to CGM alarms, or they don't want to change pump infusion sites, or they don't want to help a child to bolus. So there's still a lot of anxiety and fear, I think, out there on the part of school staff. So we do still hear about that, and the solution to that is education and training, and training the school nurse. Again, school nurses have lots on their plates. I mean, they're getting it from all sides, but to train the school staff too, so that they can provide that care. Another key issue that we're starting to hear about again as schools come back together in person, denial to students to go on field trips unless a parent comes along. So that's always been a concern. So parents, just know that your student, your child, cannot be denied an opportunity to go on a field trip just because you can't go, and because they feel like the schools feel like they don't have the resources to send someone along on the field trip. Field trips are school-sponsored events. Most extracurricular activities, before school, after school, many of those activities are school-sponsored. So schools do have obligations under federal law to provide care during those activities.
That's amazing. There's so many helpful resources out there. And for everybody that's just now tuning in, just as a reminder, you can visit diabetes.org/SafeAtSchool. And you can find all of these gems right on there that Crystal is talking about. I know we're almost at time, so I wanted to end on an exciting note. So could you talk a little bit about a recent New York City win? While I know that you described it as just the beginning, I'm sure it's quite a milestone in the long journey that you've been on with SafeAtSchool.
Absolutely. So just a little background. A little over 3 years ago, the association and some New York City public school families of children with diabetes filed a lawsuit against New York City public schools and other defendants. And part of the allegations of the complaint were that, for example, there's no one trained on the bus to take care of a child with diabetes in the event that there was a hypoglycemic incident. Another allegation was that New York City public schools were discriminating because some students were being told they couldn't go on a field trip if there was no school nurse. So the recent success is that the court recently ruled in ADA's favor on some motions for summary judgment, requiring New York City public schools to establish a pool of school nurses who can go on field trips with students with diabetes. And also the order requires New York City public schools to train bus drivers and bus attendants in the administration of glucagon. So this is a big team effort. It took several years. This is just the beginning of more good things for students with diabetes, students in New York, and really students all over the country can benefit from this decision.
That's amazing, and congratulations. I'm sure it was difficult and challenging, but progress is happening, so that's amazing. And
Yeah.
I guess before we close, what can we expect in the future? What are you working on right now?
Yes, so we have some resources, some longstanding resources in our SafeAtSchool portfolio that need a little bit of a facelift. And I know many of the diabetes community are familiar with these resources. We have a school guide that we are working on revamping. And also we have our school training modules that are being updated. And we hope to roll both of those updates out this summer with our back to school promotion. So be on the lookout for those. And the only other thing I just want to say, yes, we've got this wealth of resources online. Please use them. We also have a 1-800 number, 1-800-DIABETES, or email askdiabetes@diabetes.org that folks can reach out to if your child is experiencing a problem, a discrimination problem at school. And ADA will respond with some information and some guidance and some suggestions about how one might resolve that problem. But in the meantime, if there are some challenges with the care, parents should work with their school nurses, work hand in hand with school nurses, work with their school administrators, be objective, try to understand the school side, even especially during this global pandemic. I mean, we're still trying to figure it out, right? So just, be reasonable. We want to make sure all of these kids get the care they need and that they are safe at school. But it is communication, it is planning, it's working with your child's diabetes provider. All of these team members are critical in supporting the child with diabetes at school.
Absolutely. And I guess to summarize, we are here for you, right? The
Absolutely.
ADA is here for you. These incredible resources, the amazing work that Crystal and team has been doing. I mean, it's working. And Crystal, with your story, your inspiring story with your daughter, that's an example alone, just how powerful the world, the community can be, the diabetes journey can be, if we all band together and work together to create positive change. So I want to remind everyone that's watching to check out the chat box down below. I've actually dropped some of the information that Crystal has been talking about today. So the 1-800-diabetes number, as well as the email that she referenced, askada@diabetes.org. And there's a lot of really exciting events happening that I'm working on with Crystal for SafeAtSchool over the coming months. But also keep an eye out on our social media channels for all of these wonderful resources. SafeAtSchool information is out there, and it's so easy to find if you go to diabetes.org/SafeAtSchool. So, Crystal, I really want to thank you so much for joining us today on this wonderful Friday. A great way to close out the week, and
Absolutely.
we can, join and go right into the weekend. And any final words, Crystal, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, just know that ADA is here for you. Reach out to us, reach out to your providers, talk to other parents. There's so many more resources and so many more sources of help these days compared to 1991 when my daughter was diagnosed and I just felt so alone. So take advantage of those resources and come to ADA, because we can help you to navigate those resources. And just be well, everyone, and have a fabulous weekend.
Absolutely.
Thank you
you
so
all.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.